The vision faded, the orb turned black and shattered into a hail of obsidian shards. Mr. Nelson gulped as Thraxus rose from his throne and paced back and forth across the chamber. "Bad news, boss?" "For both of us." A stormy expression crossed the warlock's face as he spoke. "You're not gonna beat me again, are you?" Thraxus smirked and gave a soft chuckle. "Of course I'm going to beat you again, Mr. Nelson. That's why I keep you around. It's just a question of when." "But not now." Thraxus shot Mr. Nelson a very cruel look, which sent the goblin scrambling for cover. "Not yet." Thraxus strode to the nearest window and gazed out over his bleak domain. "It would appear we have a squatter in my Blackwood." The warlock's voice lowered into a growl. "I'm going to need more power." "More power?" the goblin repeated. Then his eyes grew wide as it dawned on him. "You don't mean—" "I do, Mr. Nelson." Thraxus set off down the stairway. "It's time to invoke the Lord of Blades." The goblin crept to the edge of the stairway. "You sure that's wise, boss? Digging his hooks in even deeper?" "In for a penny, in for a pound," Thraxus' answer floated back up the stairway. The goblin gulped. Boss, maybe we should just give up on this one. There's other princesses to kidnap, and other kings to blackmail." For a moment, the goblin was answered with silence. "Boss?" Then the goblin felt it again, the sensation of talons closing around his throat, as an unseen force dragged him over the side and carried him down, down, down into the waiting clutches of his vengeful master. Thrax's mouth twisted into a false grin, and he gave a hollow, mirthless laugh. "You're right, of course. There are other kings, with other daughters. But you see, the trouble is, I don't care about those other kings, or those other daughters. The only one that matters to me is good King Peter. Is that clear, Mr. Nelson?" The goblin nodded furiously. "I'm glad we cleared that up." Thraxus released his hold on Mr. Nelson's throat, letting the goblin drop roughly to the floor. In the warlock's deepest dungeon he kept it, a grotesque, jagged idol, assembled from pile upon pile of weapons, scavenged from the corpses of glory-seeking knights and princes that had fallen prey to the obsidian tower. It was faintly humanoid in shape, a razor ribcage over which loomed a spine of steel vertebrae and a crown of daggers. Its shoulder blades were axe heads, its arms cylinders of combined swords, its hands claws of steel, cradling an obsidian chalice filled with a sparkling metal dust. Though the idol itself was not the Lord of Blades, there was a malicious awareness about it. It had no eyes, and yet it watched. It had no ears, and yet it listened. And what the idol saw and heard, so too did the Lord of Blades. Normally, Thraxus would inhale a pinch of the metal dust, not unlike a bit of snuff. But now, as his hold on the whole situation crumbled, and he sank to increasingly desperate measures, the warlock instead plunged his fist into the chalice, wisps of ground metal trickling from between his fingers as he withdrew an unusually large handful. Thraxus gazed up at the idol as he held out his fist. "I'm unsatisfied with our bargain." Drawing his hand towards his nose, he inhaled deeply, breathing in thick, glittering wisps of the dust. As he exhaled, he added in a whisper, "So I'm amending it." The sharp steel crystals ripped and tore at the warlock's vulnerable flesh as they swirled through his nose and throat. He coughed as the dust blew through his lungs, ejecting tiny red flecks onto the floor, only to continue breathing it all in once he recovered. He doubled over in dizzying pain as new metal grains embedded themselves in the fresh cuts and burrowed deeper into his flesh. Yet still he continued, until his raw, reddened hand was empty. Thraxus dropped to his knees before the idol, propping himself up on his knuckles as he continued to cough up blood. Then something solid flew from his mouth, and the pain began to recede. Thraxis' mind slowly cleared, and his vision came back into focus. On the ground before him, a form twitched and shook, throwing off the ruddy ooze that dripped from its body. For a moment it resembled a large fly, or maybe a wasp, but as it scraped itself clean, the truth became apparent. It was, in fact, an animated bundle of blades, clicking, fluttering, and chirping as if it were an insect. The obsidian chalice, meanwhile, began to rattle and shake in the idol's grip. Swirling clouds of the metal dust rose and drifted over its sides, settling in small piles on the floor. From these little metal ant-hills issued forth many more animated blades, crawling and creeping like insects until a steel swarm bowed before their newly formed monarch. "Excellent," Thraxis breathed, sighing wearily as he scooped up the steel monarch. He staggered to his feet, chuckling as he rose. "You know what to do," he whispered to his new ally. "Find her and end her." The only response was the whir of metal wings as the monarch rose into the air above Thraxis and flashed away. The swarm followed after, the sharp edges of their wings and limbs tearing and ripping at Thraxis' skin and clothes as they passed in a blizzard of blades. The goblin, when he finally opened his eyes, squealed in fright at the visage before him. There was no blood, only empty black fissures slashed across Thraxis' face, twisting and distorting as he grinned with newfound confidence. "Well now, Elizabeth, let's see you escape this one." Yet as the steel swarm rushed across the countryside, the warlock's path, so adept at confounding and ensnaring intruders, turned against them. The insect-like bladelings bounced and crashed against the trunks of trees and the thick network of branches, decimating the swarm's numbers long before they were anywhere near their quarry. All Elizabeth was aware of was a distant, unearthly hum, but that was enough to set both her and her companions' nerves on edge.
"That doesn't sound good,"
Don remarked.
"It doesn't look good either,"
Elizabeth added. Just ahead, the trees abruptly fell away, revealing a wide, empty clearing. Empty, that is, save for the grand redwood standing atop a steep hill directly in the center. Under normal circumstances, its sheer size and majesty would have made for a welcome change from the prior monotony of ebony woodlands. But with panic in the air and an angry buzz thundering after her, all Elizabeth could think of was how little cover there was. "Think we should go back?" Stubbo suggested. The decision, however, was made for all of them when there came a low zap and a yelp of shock from the rear of the procession. "Zap!" The Father of Thousands rushed forward, bowling Don over and trampling him into the dirt. Fortunately, being a spider, even a gargantuan one, the Father of Thousands was fairly light, and the only harm Don suffered was a stomach-turning mouthful of dirt. The passageway they had come through was cut off not by trees closing in behind the group, but instead by a shimmering wall of light which crackled with power.
"Looks like the only way is forward,"
Elizabeth observed. Don looked up with a sour expression as he spat out a clod of dirt.
"Gee, you think?"
The Father of Thousands squeaked. "Well, there's no time for wasting," Stubbo exclaimed. "Let's get out of here." The little man charged away, along the base of the hill, the Father of Thousands hot on his heels. Elizabeth, however, rushed to Don's side to help him up. The way he dusted himself off, he probably would have been fine on his own, but Elizabeth was like that, always looking out for the stragglers. As the two fled for the foot of the hill, they heard it, a sound like a swarm of locusts growing rapidly nearer. A cloud burst from the cover of blackwood branches, glittering in the sunlight like a sea of diamonds. It cast an ever-shifting, shimmering shadow across the ground as it spiraled into the sky, and then it surged down, down, towards the clearing, and the forms of the fleeing princess and her knight. Tiny metal wing-like limbs rattled as the bladelings gained speed, hurtling faster and faster towards their quarry. And then there was a loud zap. The steel cloud swirled and roiled, recoiling back on itself, as a bright light rippled through the air before it. Energy crackled as the light passed through a giant dome, similar to the glass of a snow globe. More bladelings darted down for the clearing, only for the barrier to flicker back into existence, turning each of them to a little puff of silver dust on impact. Thraxis furrowed his brow as he gazed into his orb. Zap, zap, zap went the bladelings, one by one. At this rate, they'll all be gone in minutes, the warlock growled. Stupid minions. He passed a hand over the orb and shouted to the swarm. That's enough. Return to me, now. Thraxis' knuckles turned as white as his teeth as he crushed the orb in his furious grip. The goblin didn't have to ask. He knew what the news would be, and he didn't want Thraxis to notice him if the warlock didn't have to. Mr. Nelson wisely kept to his shadowy hiding place, behind the throne's armrest. Then Thraxis smirked as an icy calm settled over him. He leaned back, closing his eyes as he stretched and relaxed his fingers. Well, it appears I've finally found our squatter. Now to finish the job. With that, he stood up and descended the stairs, down, down, to floors and dungeons far below. The goblin didn't ask, and he didn't need to ask. He could tell what Thraxis was up to just by the tone of his voice. He was going on the hunt.
Don, wait!
Elizabeth shouted. Don initially just pulled harder to compensate for Elizabeth's lagging pace.
Don, they're leaving! Look!
At last, Don threw a look over his shoulder. He then ground to a halt as he saw the metal swarm retreating. Elizabeth, however, was still moving. She bowled Don over as the two collided.
Sorry,
Elizabeth muttered.
You just stopped so suddenly.
No need to apologize.
Don interrupted.
Come to think of it, I wouldn't mind if you crashed into me more often.
A stormy look crossed Elizabeth's face as she raised a warning eyebrow. Don grinned back.
Care to help me up, Liz?
Elizabeth offered Don her hand, but as he regained his feet, he let out a yell of mock surprise and pretended to slip. Both the lady and her knight fell in a heap to the ground.
Don!
Elizabeth exclaimed.
I couldn't help it.
He insisted.
There's some magic in the air that's pulling me down.
Don, can you please let me go?
I want to, I swear, but it's got a hold of you. I want to, I swear, but it's got a hold of you, and the harder we struggle, the stronger it gets.
Don, this is no time to be fooling around.
Don paused and flashed a playful grin.
Well, we're finally out of danger. I can't think of a better time.
Elizabeth allowed herself to smile and gave her knight a light chuckle.
Don?
Yeah, Liz?
Like sunshine turning to a rainstorm, Elizabeth fixed Don with an icy glare.
Let me up.
As reflexively as a heartbeat, Don obeyed. The very thought of doing otherwise never crossed his mind. Elizabeth gave Don an irritated look as she straightened her garment about her shoulders. Don simply grinned back up at her.
Help me up?
Elizabeth answered him with a coy smirk as she offered Don her hand.
You know,
Don mused.
I was just joking about helping me up.
Elizabeth grinned.
Funny. So was I.
She then hooked her heel behind Don's boot and yanked his foot out from under him. Don stumbled to the ground with a yell. Elizabeth chuckled down at him.
Two can play at that game.
Ha ha, very funny.
Don muttered as he staggered to his feet. It was right about then that Stubbo and the Father of Thousands reappeared. It began with a cry of horror from somewhere behind Don. Then Elizabeth saw them, Stubbo dashing madly with a storm of legs churning behind him around the side of the hill.
Ain't no way out,
Stubbo shouted.
This place is just a big circle. No way out.
And no way in, apparently.
Elizabeth mused.
I feel like a mouse in a trap.
Well, that's because you are a mouse.
Don remarked. Pausing a moment, he added,
Well, in real life anyway.
All at once, the Father of Thousands ground to a halt and pointed skyward with a loud coo of ah. All gazes followed the spider's lead to a vision of grand brilliance. A large golden orb descended from the regal branches overhead, expanding as it drew nearer. Elizabeth had to shield her eyes from the intense radiance. Inside the orb, she could just make out a figure of grand stature. The orb landed a few feet from Elizabeth, and as it faded, her vision cleared, and she could see the entity that had ridden within. Elizabeth's head dipped downward, and she raised a curious eyebrow. The being was not nearly so impressive now that he appeared. He was, in fact, just under a foot tall, shorter even than Stubbo.
Greetings and salutations, Lord and Lady. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Ganor Fidelensky III, shrew master of the wood and future emperor of the whole world.
Elizabeth blinked.
A parrot? The future emperor of...
The little bird set his wings on his hips, and a rather cross look swept over his face.
I assure you, Lady Elizabeth, I am no mere parrot. I am, in fact, the most powerful wizard the world has ever known.
Elizabeth crossed her arms and gave Genorf a skeptical smirk.
A parrot? The most powerful wizard ever known?
Genorf heaved a sigh of disgust.
Yes, I am. Where lesser sorcerers beg spirits and demons for favors, I wrench and twist and mold the very fabric of the cosmos to my will.
That how y'all became a parrot?
Stubbo asked. Genorf rolled his eyes and reluctantly nodded.
Yes, it is. Now enough with the parrot business already.
The bird took a deep breath to calm himself. Looking back up to Elizabeth, he went on.
Step into my house, my lady. You'll be safe here. You'll be able to rest and eat and...
At the mention of eating, Elizabeth's stomach gave a thundering rumble. Her cheeks flushed red, and her eyes glazed over.
Eat?
Yes, eat, Genorf repeated. You know, regain your strength before continuing on.
She already had breakfast.
Dawn interrupted.
Several breakfasts, actually, and several lunches, about a dozen dinners at that.
Okay, try that one more time.
Several breakfasts, actually, and several lunches and a few dozen dinners at that.
Elizabeth shot Dawn an irritated glance, only for her annoyance to evaporate as she nodded.
Yes, it's true.
Genorf looked her up and down.
Fascinating.
Turning towards the hill, Genorf hopped and fluttered away.
This way, then.
The parrot led his guests in a gently sloping spiral up the hill, and then around the redwood trunk until a remarkably broad door came into view.
Hey,
Stubbo exclaimed.
how come we didn't see that on the first round?
Magic, Genorf answered, as if that should explain everything.
Weren't you listening? I am the most powerful wizard in...
Yeah, in all the land.
Stubbo cut him off.
And what's with this defective map y'all sold me?
I will address it when I am able,
Genorf answered tersely.
For now, could one of you please open the door? I'm afraid my wings are insufficient.
Dawn held the door open for Elizabeth, and then darted in after her. Stubbo likely would have slammed the door behind him, locking Genorf out, had the Father of Thousands not shoved his way in behind Stubbo. Genorf, for his part, rode in on the spider's back. Elizabeth gave a gasp of wonder as she looked up and around at the grand chamber before her.
It's beautiful.
The chamber was immense, far larger than should have been possible. Glowing silver orbs hung from the high rafters. 2 grand, curving stairways led up to a balcony that encircled the room, and between them stood an oak double door, inscribed with the emblem of a dragon in flight. Both the ground floor and the balcony were set with numerous smaller doors, presumably leading to other chambers.
Well, I can't take all the credit,
Genorf insisted, yet he couldn't help swelling just the slightest bit with pride.
I had a great deal of help from my minions.
Minions?
Elizabeth repeated, prompting Genorf to elaborate.
Of course, minions. You don't expect me to conquer the world alone, do you?
Don's brow furrowed with suspicion, and he fingered his daggers.
Right. And where would these minions be right now?
Well, of course,
Ganorf began, only to falter as he rubbed his head with one wing.
Well, I have absolutely no idea.
He glanced around the chamber and even fluttered up to the balcony.
I don't even think this is my home,
he mused. Then he shook his head and slapped himself several times with a wing. He grinned sheepishly as he peered over the side of the balcony.
Well then, shall we proceed to the kitchen?
Elizabeth's stomach answered with a growl.
No,
Don interrupted.
not the kitchen. Anywhere but the kitchen.
Elizabeth squeezed Don's arm as she leaned close.
Yes, Don. The kitchen. I'm starving.
Don glanced up at Ganorf and gulped.
Just where is the kitchen?
Right this way, my friends,
Ganorf answered. He hopped down from the railing and fluttered over to the double door at the far side of the chamber.
Really, please, come this way. I've been locked out ever since my little accident.
Ganorf chuckled sheepishly.
No hands.
A whirlwind of scents greeted Elizabeth as the doors swung open. Spices and herbs, salts and sauces. The small circular chamber was dimly lit by the flames of a great stone fireplace, over which hung a modestly sized cauldron. The walls were lined with shelves laden with bottles of various powders and fluids. The centerpiece of the room was a round wooden table surrounded by a handful of chairs and stools. As Elizabeth stepped into the room, she gave a cry of fright. Don quickly stepped in front of her, drawing a dagger to contend with whatever it was. There was no need. At the far side of the room, partially obscured in the shadows, a grinning face peered out from between the bars of a small, cramped cage. A hand waved through a narrow gap, while thick, curly green hair pushed its way out through the little openings circling the top of the cage.
Ah, my apologies,
Ganorf spoke up.
I may have neglected to mention, I did not become a parrot. I switched bodies with one. Things have been a sorry mess since then.
I'm Farrago,
The man in the cage squawked.
He'll also be your chef this evening, Ganorf added. I would cook for you myself, but, well, as you can see...
Ganorf grinned sheepishly as he held up his wings for emphasis. Don mused.
Wil, Chrissy, is there anything you guys can do?
The two fairies poked their heads out of Elizabeth's hair and glanced uncertainly at each other. Chrissy was the first to speak.
Is there?
Wil scratched his head and thought.
I think so. We're fairies, right?
Don't bother, Ganorf interrupted. My magic is immensely potent. I doubt a less experienced wizard could make a dent in the spell, never mind a fairy.
Oh, can't we?
Wil muttered indignantly.
I'll show you what we can't do. Come on, Chrissy.
With a look of intense determination, he fluttered into the air, rolling up his sleeves as if for a fight.
What are we doing?
Chrissy asked.
We're doing magic, and we're putting this turkey in his place.
That won't be necessary,
Ganorf insisted.
I can assure you I'll find a solution soon enough.
Quit squawking and hold still, you big chicken.
Ganorf gave a yelp of fright as Wil darted after him and fled along the topmost shelves of his kitchen. The two darted around jars and upturned bottles, across the ceiling and under the table.
Someone get me popcorn, Farrago shouted. This is better than the Late Show.
The fairy and parrot stopped a moment mid-chase.
If you must experiment, Ganorf quipped, you can try your hand on him.
Wil paused, regarding Farrago, and then Ganorf in turn.
Nah, you're the one that thinks he's hot stuff.
A lightning-quick pair of hands snatched the fairy and bird out of the air and brought them close to Elizabeth's irritated face.
That's enough out of both of you.
He started it!
He started it!
Wil and Ganorf exclaimed in unison. Elizabeth silenced them with a warning glare.
Someone want to let me out of here?
Farrago piped up.
My back is killing me!
I'll handle it.
Don told Elizabeth.
You work things out with the little fellas.
Don took a dagger to the cage, severing the flimsier beams and prying the stronger ones away from each other. When at last there was a fair-sized opening, Farrago tumbled out and landed stiffly on the floor, his arms and legs scrunched together in much the same posture they had been in while he was in the cage.
I miss my old body,
Farrago whimpered.
Well, you'll just have to accustom yourself to this one,
Genorf answered haughtily.
It may be some time before I can come up with the proper counter-charm.
It'd go a lot faster if you'd let me try,
Wil snapped. Elizabeth gave him another warning glare.
I think you've done enough for now.
You weren't complaining when I turned your rubber dagger into a sword.
Elizabeth's brow furrowed, her glare growing in intensity. Wil gulped.
Sorry, Miss Hartley.
Elizabeth's expression softened, and she let the fairy go.
It's all right. Just behave yourself.
There was a loud creak as Don pried Farrago's legs straight.
How long were you in that cage?
There was a low crack as Farrago gave a faint shrug.
Ah, beats me. Feels like a lifetime.
Now then, Genorf went on, if you would be so good as to release me.
Only if you behave yourself.
Elizabeth answered him with a sharp look.
We still have this body-swapping business to take care of.
Genorf heaved a disgusted sigh.
My dear lady, now that Farrago is released, that will no longer be an issue. He can compensate for my shortcomings until such time as we are set right.
Elizabeth glanced uncertainly to Farrago. He was now standing, his legs unfolded, but still so stiff Elizabeth could hear his knees squeaking His legs unfolded, but still so stiff Elizabeth could hear his knees squeaking like rusty hinges. His arms, however, were still scrunched up against his chest and shoulders, as if he were still trapped in the cage.
Come with me.
Don spoke up.
I know of a few stretches that might help.
Farrago nodded uncomfortably.
I just wish Genorf could switch us back.
On that note, Don led Farrago out into the main chamber, and for the next 15 minutes, Elizabeth and her companions were inundated with rather loud sounds of groaning, creaking, and cracking. Elizabeth winced every time Farrago moaned, nearly feeling the aches and pains herself. Then Don and Farrago returned. Don had to half-carry Farrago as his formerly stick-like legs, now loosened up, flopped about like rubber bands.
Something tells me you're in no condition to be cooking,
Don muttered. Elizabeth patted the chair next to her.
Please sit down.
Oh, wow,
Farrago sighed.
No wonder we're all trying to save her. I like this one.
Then I'll require another volunteer,
Genorf added. He glanced around the room.
Will anyone step up to the task?
The Father of Thousands raised a hand. It wasn't his hand, granted, but it got the signal across.
Not you.
The Father of Thousands lowered the hand with a grumble and sucked absently on the fingers. Don rolled his eyes.
Okay, fine. I'll volunteer.
Genorf nodded.
Very good, then. As for the rest of you, be seated. Well, except for you, Spidey, just do the best you can.
The Father of Thousands crossed his forelimbs over his chest with a faint scoff and turned his back on the parrot wizard.
So, what's for dinner?
Elizabeth asked. She paused a moment, licking the saliva from her lips, her anticipation having briefly gotten the better of her. Genorf gazed haughtily up at Elizabeth, cracking a knowing smirk.
Only my famous quick-cooked chili?
Uh-oh,
Farrago murmured.
What?
Don asked.
Is there something wrong with it?
Well,
Farrago hesitated.
I could eat it just fine, and Wizzy here's got no problem with it, but it packs a bit of a kick. Might be a bit much for the uninitiated.
Don chuckled and smirked in Elizabeth's general direction.
Okay. This I've got to see.
Let us begin, Genorf barked and fluttered over to the cauldron. First, to select the proper base.
You mean, like, hamburger and beans?
Don suggested. Genorf scoffed.
Well, if you want to do it the easy way, sure. Me, I prefer the proper incantation. It makes each bite explode in your mouth.
Oh, like explode with flavor?
Elizabeth asked. Farrago winced and shook his head.
No, he means it really explodes. Boom!
Enough, Genorf thundered, casting the shadows of his wings across the walls.
The time for talk is over. Now is the time to cook.
Elizabeth forced a smile and folded her hands in her lap, waiting silently. Her stomach, however, was not so polite. It growled out what sounded almost like words.
Bring on the food!
You, sir?
Don.
Don, bring the spoon. Yes, that one. Now begin stirring, and don't stop until I say.
Don peered down into the cauldron and then glanced skeptically towards Genorf.
What exactly am I stirring?
Genorf set his wings on his hips indignantly as he glanced up at Don in irritation.
Just stir. All will be revealed in its due time.
Don rolled his eyes and did as he was told with his right hand. With his left, however, he made a discreet screwball gesture, prompting a soft giggle from Elizabeth and a slightly louder one from the fairies.
You think me mad, don't you?
Genorf mused. He fluttered back to the table and regarded each of his guests in turn.
All of you all think I'm mad!
Elizabeth glanced awkwardly to each of her companions, all of whom were lightly nodding.
Well, you are acting like it.
Oh,
Genorf scoffed.
Then watch, and we shall see who is truly mad.
With that, he turned back to the cauldron, and, spreading his wings, began to chant an ancient incantation.
Mold and mildew, musty must, you taint my home and break my trust. Now earn your keep, perform this test. As beef and beans, you'll feed my visitors?
Don raised an eyebrow.
There's still nothing in the pot.
Keep stirring,
Genorf barked.
The wizard's spell are a little silly,
Farrago whispered to Elizabeth.
but they work. Trust me.
I hope so.
Elizabeth muttered, rubbing her stomach as it roiled and roared. Then it began. At first faint, but then growing in scale. There were motions in the dark corners. Bits of blackness, light and feathery, drifting upwards and then drawing in the cauldron's general direction. Stringy wisps of white unfurled from the walls, floating past as Elizabeth and her companions gazed on in amazement. Little mushrooms hopped down from the walls and hopped along the floor in a steady, almost military procession, only to leap their searing deaths in the burning heat of the cauldron.
You expect her to eat this?
Don asked. Genorf grinned and let out a loud, mad laugh.
Of course not. Not yet. Mwahaha! Mwahaha! Keep stirring!
Don shrugged helplessly in Elizabeth's direction.
Pepper!
Genorf shouted. Don spotted the appropriate shaker on a shelf and shook it with his free hand.
How much?
Yes!
Don rolled his eyes. As he moved to shake a bit into the strange concoction, however, the cap simply popped off, and the sum total of the shaker's contents gushed into the brew. Steam billowed from the cauldron, accompanied by the unearthly scream of a boiling teapot.
Hemostatic stabilizer!
Don shot Genorf a confused look.
What?
Genorf chuckled sheepishly.
Sorry, wrong procedure.
Taking a breath to regain his composure, Genorf went on.
Seasoned salt, paprika, oregano!
With each addition, the reaction in the cauldron grew more erratic and violent. The contents glowed a fiery orange. There arose a low sulphuric hiss, accompanied with the stench of brimstone. There were the sounds of agonized wails from the depths of the inferno.
Tabasco sauce!
Don looked with horror to Genorf.
Not the Tabasco sauce.
Yes, you fool! The Tabasco sauce! Pour it in! Pour it all in! Bring on the spice! Give my creation spice!
Elizabeth ground her teeth in a fake grin as she glanced to Farrago. Farrago just shook his head. Flames shot from the cauldron in a blazing pillar, expanding outwards into a little mushroom cloud as Don stirred the Tabasco sauce into the mixture. When he withdrew the wooden spoon, everything below the handle had been burned off.
I think we're done here.
Ganor fluttered to the cauldron's edge and eagerly peered in. The surface of the chili had turned coal black and glowed dark red with an inner flame.
It's alive! He exclaimed. Oh, it's alive! It's alive!
Is he always so dramatic?
Elizabeth asked.
Nah, only when we have guests.
So then,
Ganor laughed triumphantly as he regarded each of them in turn.
ha ha ha, who wants the first bowl?
He likely would have been met with silence, were it not for one thing. Elizabeth's stomach roared with hunger, accompanied by an eager shout of
Me!
Shouldn't one of us test it first?
Don suggested.
Just to make it sure it's safe to eat? She is the king's daughter, after all.
Yeah, Stubbo agreed. It's the honorable thing to do. Go ahead, Mr. Night Person Man.
I'll do it.
Farrago volunteered.
I'm used to it.
Don spooned several ladlefuls into a wooden bowl.
Fine. Your funeral, pal.
Farrago downed the chili in a single gulp and set the empty bowl on the table with a light clatter. Looking around the table, he spoke.
There, see? It's fine. Perfectly all.
His voice faltered, slipping into a faint wheeze mid-sentence. His clothes grew dark and wet, and sweat pooled around his feet. His eyes glazed over, his vision blurred with a thick, steaming mist. Farrago coughed, and a small puff of smoke floated out of his mouth.
Polly wants a drink of water.
Third shelf from the top, Ganor instructed. You'll find my famous bottomless decanter. We never eat a meal without it.
I can't imagine why.
Don mumbled as he retrieved the appropriate container. No sooner had Don poured out a cup than Farrago seized the drink in both hands and dumped it down his throat. Steam issued from Farrago's mouth as he sighed in relief. Ganor turned to Elizabeth and raised an inquisitive eyebrow.
Next?
Don furiously shook his head, silently mouthing the word no. Elizabeth, however, ignored him and politely nodded. Don rolled his eyes at the ceiling with a disgusted sigh. As Ganor turned to tell him to proceed, Don was already busy filling up a fresh bowl. As he handed the bowl and a spoon to Elizabeth, Don couldn't bring himself to look her in the eye. He forced himself instead to focus on the floor. Elizabeth forced a smile as she accepted the dish.
Well, bon appetit.
All eyes were fixed on Elizabeth as she took her first tentative bite. Well, except for Don, who was afraid to watch. She was silent for a time as she chewed, rolling the mixture around in her mouth, and then finally swallowed. Then she shrugged and took another bite, and another, and another. Before long, the spoon was reduced to a faint blur as Elizabeth shoveled spoonful after spoonful into her mouth. At last, she sat back and heaved a sigh of relief.
Farrago spoke up. Are you feeling all right?
Elizabeth nodded.
It's a little bland, but not bad.
Ganor stared, unbelieving, at Elizabeth.
Bland?
But not bad.
Elizabeth repeated.
It'll fill the stomach.
And burn a hole in it.
Farrago mumbled.
My chili bland?
Elizabeth held out her bowl.
May I have some more, please?
Ganor and Don locked eyes. The parrot shrugged.
This is the first time anyone's asked for seconds.
Don cracked a smirk and chuckled.
You're just full of surprises tonight.
Elizabeth likely would have emptied the cauldron in one go had she been given the chance. After her 10th bowl, however, Don intervened.
You need to stay light on your feet, remember? We've got a long way ahead of us, and it won't be much fun walking if you're too full.
Water?
Farrago offered, lifting Genorf's decanter for emphasis. After a cool, refreshing drink, Elizabeth leaned back and rubbed her stomach with a sigh. Don, however, was still in business mode. Turning back to Genorf, he asked,
Is there a place she can wash up? Maybe get a fresh change of clothes?
Genorf nodded.
Yes, of course. I think. Farrago?
Genorf's pet stood up, legs still wobbling, but now considerably stronger.
This way, lady.
The unsteady man led Elizabeth back into the main hall and up the stairs to one of the many doors. Back in the kitchen, however, Don motioned for Stubbo to join him at the table.
Now,
Don began.
I understand we have some business to take care of.
Yes, Genorf nodded grimly. Thraxis is on the move, pursuing Our Lady. The Warlock's path will be a death trap.
So, we'll need an alternative route.
Don concluded. Turning to Stubbo, he added,
I remember you saying you had a map.
Yeah, an effective one.
Stubbo shot Genorf a dirty look.
An effective map he sold me. The ink must have been running, 'cause every time I looked at it, it was different.
Genorf scoffed.
That map is not defective. It is magic. When the wood changes, the map changes to match it.
Oh, sure, it's a magic map. That's why it kept screwing up.
It should be easy enough to prove.
Don mused.
You still have it?
Do I still have it?
Stubbo repeated with a sneer.
Yeah, I got it right here.
With that, he produced a roll of parchment and slammed it down on the table.
And I want a refund.
Let me see.
Don added, grabbing up the map and spreading it out on the table. Several landmarks were clearly set out, including the Obsidian Tower, the Wizard's Tree, and the Spider's Bog. Also shown were the Warlock's Path and an array of smaller paths throughout the forest, crossing occasionally in a vast web-like pattern.
Does Thraxis have a map like this?
Don asked.
Yes and no, Genorf answered. No doubt he keeps track of the landscape, marking out his changes to the roads and paths, but this map is one of a kind.
What about these paths?
Don added, motioning towards the various smaller pathways marked out.
Does he know about these?
Genorf shrugged.
No doubt he's come across a few in his time, and no doubt he's buried a few. I can't say for sure which ones he's aware of, but those that remain are untouched by his taint, which leads me to believe he is unaware of them.
Stubbo grunted as he peered down at the map.
Well, I still don't see any changing going on.
Wait!
Don exclaimed.
Right here.
He pointed to a passage leading from the Warlock's Path to the Spider's Bog.
I don't remember that being there.
Well, we were carried through the treetops,
Stubbo pointed out.
so we got no way of knowing what was there.
I also traveled the Warlock's Path to the Obsidian Tower.
Don added.
I can confirm that there were no paths branching off on the way out.
Then Thraxis is approaching,
Genorf concluded.
and we have no way of knowing how close he is. He may have begun his pursuit the moment you escaped his tower, or he may have begun his pursuit hours later. He could be anywhere.
Don grunted, his brow furrowing at the prospect.
Then we need to be on our way.
Yes,
Genorf agreed.
we must.
What? You're coming with us?
Indeed. Thraxis is as much my enemy as yours, and I believe you may find yourselves in need of some magical support.
Ah, jeez,
Stubbo groaned, burying his face in his arms.
just when I thought I was rid of the last one.
Ugh, the Father of Thousands squeaked curiously. Don gave a short chuckle.
Sounds like there's a story there.
Stubbo made a light nodding motion.
I'll tell you all about it later.
He mumbled. Without another word, Don rolled up the map and made for the kitchen door. Genorf fluttered after him, landing lightly on Don's shoulder. They were followed by the Father of Thousands. Stubbo, however, lingered for a time, shaking his head.
We need to be off,
Don announced as he entered the main chamber.
What? Already?
Farrago squawked.
Thraxis is on his way.
Don answered.
There's no time to lose.
But the lady just...
Farrago was cut off with the sound of a door swinging open and shut overhead. Elizabeth emerged, refreshed and ready to go. Her torn dress was replaced with a deep forest green tunic, and a bright scarlet cloak was slung about her shoulders. Her face turned a shade to match as she descended the stairs. The tunic hung low, fortunately, but not quite low enough for Elizabeth's comfort. Don had a magnificent view of her shapely legs, and his reaction showed quite clearly on his face.
It was the best I could find.
Elizabeth explained, quite self-consciously.
On the plus side, at least I don't have to walk barefoot.
She had found a pair of leather boots just the right size.
What I wouldn't give for some pants.
No need,
Genorf answered.
the cut of the tunic is quite sufficient for one's clothing needs.
Well, then you wear it.
Elizabeth retorted. Farrago chuckled.
It isn't his size.
That's enough!
Don and Genorf barked in unison. The two briefly glanced at one another and then shook their heads.
We need to be off.
Genorf announced.
You can change into something more ladylike when we're safe in your father's castle.
Don added.
For now, mobility is more important than... well, it's more important.
Here, here.
Stubbo agreed as he emerged from the kitchen and laid eyes on Elizabeth.
So let's all get mobile.
As the troop emerged from the tree, Genorf and Farrago lingered for a time, gazing wistfully on their former dwelling. Elizabeth brought the others to a halt as she returned to check on the two newest additions to her crew.
Is something the matter?
Farrago nodded.
As we get further away, Wizzy's influence here will weaken.
Genorf nodded solemnly.
My protections over this glade will fade, and Thraxis will be able to trespass freely.
Genorf closed his eyes for a moment and shook his head. When they opened again, there was a fierce rage in his gaze.
That warlock had better not mess up my kitchen!
Yeah!
Farrago agreed. Motioning towards Genorf, he discreetly whispered to Elizabeth,
That's his job!
I heard that!
On that note, Elizabeth and the wizard rejoined the others. Don, following the map, led them to a path out of the clearing and back into the ebon depths of Thraxis' realm. The trees closed in about Elizabeth once more as she followed Don down, down, down into the dark. The fairies, Wil and Chrissy, provided a pair of pale silver orbs to light the way. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Don to read by. So the hours passed, or perhaps it was only a few minutes. The path faded away underfoot, narrow and winding, with no way out but forward or back.